Okay, hello everybody. My name is Carol Boudreau, and I am the Land Tenure and Resource Rights Practice Lead for the Cloudburst Group, a USAID implementing partner. We'd like to thank you for joining us today for this webinar. We will be discussing USAID's recently released Land Tenure Country Profile on Tanzania with Dr. Maureen Moriarty-Lempke. I want to give you a brief sense of how the webinar will go this morning. After Dr. Moriarty-Lempke's presentation, we'll take some questions and provide you with some answers. Let me let you know that you can send questions to us via Twitter, or if you're joining us through the Canvas platform, you can send questions through Canvas, and we'll pass them on to Dr. Moriarty-Lempke. Then following Maureen's presentation, and in collaboration with the FAO and the Global Donor Working Group on Land, I will be presenting a brief overview of the voluntary guidelines on the responsible governance of tenure of land, fisheries, and forests in the context of national food security. After that brief presentation, we will also take some questions and answers. And so with that, I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce to you Dr. Moriarty-Lempke, who is an expert on land tenure, conflict, peace building, and security. Her PhD is from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and her work has focused on conflict-affected areas, including in places such as Afghanistan, Haiti, Kosovo, Liberia, Sri Lanka, Tanzania, and Ukraine. Maureen served as a visiting lecturer at Duke University's Program in International Development Policy. She taught courses related to land, conflict mitigation, and the connection between land tenure, property rights, and issues including food security, climate change, natural resource management, and urban informal development. In addition, Dr. Moriarty-Lempke is one of our presenters in USAID's massive open online course on land tenure and property rights. So we're pleased to have one of our MOOC presenters with us. And she's the author of numerous publications, including, as I mentioned a moment ago, the updated Tanzania Land Tenure Country Profile. Maureen, we are so pleased to have you join us here today for this discussion. And with that brief introduction, I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Carol. Can you hear me? Yes, great, wonderful. I'm so happy to be here. I have enjoyed my work in Tanzania so much, and before I begin, I just would like to say that what I present to you is strictly my work. It doesn't represent USAID as a whole, so I'll just go through some of the key highlights about what is happening in Tanzania in terms of land tenure, property rights, and also resource governance, because Tanzania, I think sometimes it can be forgotten that Tanzania is one of the most wonderfully biodiverse countries in the world. It is endowed with incredible environmental resources, including its wildlife, forests, renewable energy resources, mineral resources, and it's been named one of the most 12 mega diverse countries in the world. And also 6 out of 25 biodiversity hotspots. And so when I do my presentation, I really want to begin and end with that because it is such an environmental treasure. It also has one of the second highest proportion, I believe, of nationally protected areas in all of the basin states in Africa. So it's a very rural country. 52% of Tanzania's total land area is classified as forest. However, one of the key issues here is that it is a country that is facing an incredible rate of deforestation, something like 400,000 hectares per year. And this has resulted from issues such as agricultural expansion, unsustainable utilization of forest resources, overexploitation, and other human activities. This is predominantly a human problem. It is also a predominantly rural country. 70% of its population lives in rural areas. 40% of its land is classified as agricultural. And agriculture, to that end, is also one of its leading exporters, and it's nearly a quarter of its GDP. Smallholder farmers are a really, really important part of the agricultural sector. However, many of these smallholder farmers only possess between something like 0.9 and 3 hectares of land. The livestock industry is also an important part of the economy. And again, this is primarily undertaken with smallholder farmers. Tanzania's economy, remarkably, has been its economic growth on a national scale has been really robust. It's ranging between 5 and 7% per year. But the issue is that despite this growth, it hasn't necessarily been enjoyed by whole segments of the population. The benefits have really been distributed unequally, and something like 12 million Tanzanians still live in extreme poverty, and 90% of those who are in extreme poverty live in rural areas. I don't want to focus too much on the rural question because urbanization is really well underway in Tanzania. By 2030, it's estimated that 25 million more Tanzanians will be living in urban areas, and that the demand for urban land is far outstripping the supply of urban land, with the result of proliferating informality and peri-urban growth. So what are some of the main land themes? This is a country whose property rights systems have been in flux for decades, since its independence in 1961. I would have to say, in general, there's a movement towards both affirming private property rights while also supporting progressive legislation to hold on to customary land rights as well. The Village Land Act of 1999 really has tried to decentralize customary land norms to the village level. At the same time, global interest in Tanzania's land is on the rise. Despite efforts by the government of Tanzania, large-scale land acquisition for biofuels, agriculture, forestry have encompassed significant land area. Now, at the same time, this is a country that has wanted to invest in its agricultural sector. And as an example of that, the SAGAT, which is the Southern Agricultural Growth Corridor, has delineated certain cluster areas throughout the country in a line to promote larger scale growth, but also supporting smallholder farmers. In terms of urbanization, although Dodoma is now the capital, Dar es Salaam really remains the commercial center of the country, and many of its government functions are still performed there. Again, there'll be close to 25 million people living in urban areas, and but what that in search of opportunity, but the poverty rate in these urban areas is still quite high, something like 15.5%, not as extreme as the rural areas. And it is estimated that close to 3/4 of, for example, Dar es Salaam's population lives in what are called LIAs, or low income areas. So these are certainly cities that are struggling. And in terms of the environment, again, Tanzania is so rich in water, forest, but it's also very rich in mineral resources, and and that what this has done is really pushed foreign investors to invest in the area, and this has come with mixed consequences. So so we have these pressures, and so to what extent is the land regime really able to deal with this? You know, what is the system, the land laws, the land administration, land governance? What are the systems in place that can help to address some of these pressures? Well, the land law is predominantly governed by the Land Act and Village Act, both of 1999. And the Land Act classifies land as reserved, village, and general land. Reserved land includes wildlife parks, natural reserve areas, and village land is really the bulk of Tanzania's land. Village land constitutes nearly 70% of Tanzania's total land area. This has been a process of decentralization where the central government has allowed village land to be governed at the more local level, to be demarcated, for land to be allocated for use in the village areas. In terms of foreign ownership, the Land Act really stipulates that non-citizens shall not be allocated or granted land unless it is for investment purposes. And this really is at the this is governed by the Tanzanian Investment Act. From an investment perspective, despite laws that prohibit foreigners from owning land, non-residents can certainly obtain tenure rights and of use and occupancy through what we call derivative rights. And these are the mechanisms for that is lease, joint ventures, or use rights granted by village councils. A word about women's land rights in general. Women's land rights are very well supported under formal law. The Constitution provides for equal treatment of rights to property and prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex. Given that, in terms of tenure, although most of Tanzania's tenure is under customary, all land is vested is considered public land, which the president holds as trustee of the people. The Land Act actually places all land ultimately in the vested interest of the president. The government retains rights of occupancy, development conditions, and can expropriate land for projects of public interest or value. I want to just take a moment to say that women, children, and refugees are really the most tenure insecure. I just want to take a moment to say that Tanzania houses a significant population of refugees. Women, especially in cities, have particular difficulty securing and retaining urban housing, despite helpful law. And although the law is helpful, in fact, there are many patriarchal attitudes still regarding the allocation of land in terms of titling land or even renting to women. And knowledge of land laws for women and for very vulnerable groups is not well known. It's not, there's not a high education about land rights for women and other vulnerable groups. I'm not going to spend too much time on land administration, except that there has been to say that there has been a significant attempt over the last decade or so to really improve land administration, to both uphold customary rights, but to also to formalize and to make attempts to register and demarcate lands in order to reduce land-based conflicts. The current land governance structure overall is designed to foster decentralized land administration But at the same time, the central government really continues to exercise significant control over land through the land commissioner, and to a lesser extent, perhaps through the district councils. In terms of land conflicts, well, they do exist. They exist in rural and urban land areas, and the root causes of these tend to be policy deficiencies, inadequate capacity at the local level to mitigate conflicts, but also the fact that there is not widespread demarcation of land boundaries. So in rural areas, conflicts are associated in general with increased population pressures, diversification of rural land use patterns, expansion of settled and ranching farming, and conflicts over land uses such as grazing versus cultivation, the promotion of commercial development in rural land areas. In urban and peri-urban areas, the tensions seem to be rooted mostly in land scarcity, because there's simply not enough land to accommodate all of the people who are coming and living in urban areas. So what are some of the government, we've talked about some of the major land themes, and there are others, but for time's sake, we're keeping it to these. So what has the government been doing over the last decade, and especially the most recent time? So the government, there are many documents in place. First of all, the government's long-term perspective plan, or the LTPP, and the Tanzanian Development Vision 2025 are really important developments, both aimed at transforming Tanzania into a middle-income country. The push here is really to wean itself from foreign assistance and leverage its resources to move from a low income to middle income country. The National Strategy for Growth and Reduction of Poverty is the country's organizing framework for the development of government programs, and it includes strategies to identify urban growth and agriculture as the priority areas for intervention. So just as we talked about rural poverty and urban growth, this document is attempting to address these issues in a more proactive as opposed to reactive way. And how are they going to do that? Well, through development of settlement plans, land surveys, more gender-based issuance of land titles. So there is a push to ensure that women have title to land. The establishment of land reserves in peri-urban areas to guide urban growth. Regularization of unplanned settlements. This will be a significant undertaking, since most of the urban areas are indeed informal and in desperate need of infrastructure. And then capacity building for local leaders to really understand this confluence of complicated factors, both locally and globally driven. And then, finally, it does give a nod to the pressures that smallholder farmers are really facing. At the G8 summit in the UK, I believe that was in 2000. The year is escaping me now, but the government of Tanzania and the G8 countries announced the Land Transparency Partnership, which aims to really support more transparent and efficient and better resourced land sector. I'd like to come to the final parts of this presentation by really focusing a little bit on the natural resources of the country. In terms of water resources, the important takeaway point is that Tanzania is incredibly rich in freshwater resources, but it also has water, in terms of drinking water problems and problems with access to water. it has 3 major lakes. It accounts for almost between 5 and 10% of the total surface area in the country, 8 river basins. But there is a high degree of water resource variability, both in terms of time and space. So during certain times of the year, it's the dry season and very limited rainfall. So there's the temporal dimension to that, but also spatially. Certain areas of the country have very desert-like conditions, while other areas seem not to be strained to that degree. Access to piped water, clean piped water, remains a really significant challenge. The availability of groundwater, especially during the dry season, is really problematic. And the culprits in this are of course natural seasonal variability, but there has been not a great history of management of water resources, and to be sure, population pressures in the urban areas have really strained existing water resources, and smallholder in the rural areas, irrigation systems, which smallholder farmers really rely on, are stressed as well. To its credit, the government of Tanzania has really embarked on major reforms in the water sector, and worked significantly on the legal and governance, and also more decentralization of the water sector. Moving on to trees and forests, these wonderful ecosystems, forest areas, account for 1.6 million hectares of land in Tanzania, and as a result, this is an area really rich in forest carbon stocks. And so these are, in terms of climate change mitigation, these are important resources to keep in mind. Again, as I said earlier in the presentation, deforestation is occurring at an alarmingly high rate. There is certainly a broad consensus within the government and with donor organizations, and that there really needs to be help to curb this problem. Tanzania is a UN REDD Plus program partner country, is also a member of the World Bank's Forest Carbon Partnership facility, and there is a move underway to start to define property rights relating to forest lands, and also tree tenure. The key to really protecting these forest resources are to improve and to have more effective forest management. Unclear and weak tenure arrangements still are a problem, and so in order for it to be successful within a REDD Plus partnership, that will need to happen. Interestingly, Tanzania's legal framework does support participatory forest management, which has really been found to be a key to curbing deforestation and really leveraging forest researches. Participatory forest management, I believe, began in the 1990s with a small number of pilot projects, and has really grown since that time to projects in, I think, 53 districts throughout Tanzania. That number could be changing since I've done my research. And then many donor efforts have focused on bringing land under preservation. USAID has been part of that effort, the World Wildlife Fund, and of course REDD. A word about minerals, and after tourism in Tanzania, mining is Tanzania's second fastest growing sector. The mineral sector is considered to have really tremendous potential to contribute to Tanzania's GDP if sustainably exploited and effectively managed. There are proven deposits of gold, diamonds, of course, tanzanite, tin, copper, nickel, and iron, and many other natural gas and other minerals. So as it stands right now, minerals contribute over 52% of the country's export sector, a large part of which is gold. Tanzania is believed to have among some of the largest gold reserves in Africa, lagging slightly behind South Africa, making it, really a major source of exploration and potential exploitation. It is believed that within Tanzania, mineral resources and that sector are among the most heavily regulated at the moment. To what extent I think those regulations are actually seen on the ground is probably a matter of discussion, but the 2009 Mineral Policy and 2010 Mining Act are the most significant instruments that the country has. And the country has also really done a lot to ensure that it receives its fair share of royalties from foreign companies. So this is predominantly in the area of large-scale mining. In terms of small-scale mining, this is a sector that really exists outside the ambit of the government authority. It's relatively common, and concerns of communities over land tenure and mining over land access are due to expropriation, lack of reconciliation within the land and mineral regulatory frameworks, which are often separate and contradictory, and accompanying land degradation. And again, the government recognizes the role that the mineral sector can play in terms of the economy, and is trying to call for assistance in terms of technical and institutional capacity, and assistance in mitigating environmental effects. And both government and also donor interventions have really focused on promoting good governance principles, increasing transparency of the sector, improving the legal and regulatory framework, and more sustainable approaches to the mining industry. So we've covered a lot of ground. There is, just by quick way of reference for an update, there is a development of a land policy underway in Tanzania. So it is a country that is continually seeking to address, I think, the weaknesses in land policy. Some would say with mixed success, but that really concludes. You can certainly review the profile online, which is much more thorough, but I wanted to make sure that I covered the main points, and that is it. Thank you.
Maureen, thank you so much for that overview of USAID's land tenure country profile on Tanzania. For those of you watching, you'll probably know that Tanzania is a critically important country for so many reasons. I wanted to alert our participants to an upcoming online debate about Tanzania that's going to be taking place at the Land Portal from June 5th to the 16th. If you're interested in Tanzania and development issues in the country, you might want to register to participate at thelandportal.info/debates. And with that, we're going to open up the discussion to some questions. Maureen, I have a first question for you, which is, what do you see as possible good approaches to improving urban settlements and urban tenure issues in Tanzania?
Well, that's a great question. I think in the first place, the issue of regularization, of upgrading and providing key infrastructure in some of these urban areas is really critical. And then one of the shortcomings in at least in my experience in Dar is that there is a lack of focused land use planning. There is very little in the way of in guiding future growth. It's very haphazard development planning that's going on, and I think that resources to engage in more. My feeling about this is, even if it's strategic planning, or it doesn't necessarily, I mean, in a perfect world, master planning would be ideal, but the growth and the continued influxes of populations might prohibit this in the short term, but and so a more strategic approach to planning would help. I want to say also that my experience in Dar also is that this is an area that is in real need of some climate change adaptation. The city is, in certain areas, is really prone to flooding, and so building resilience planning into the planning processes will also help in terms of the overall quality of life in the cities, and more sustainable construction. Another point is that there is a very active black and gray market in land market transactions, and so what that means is that there is very little known about who owns what, and as a result, there's no opportunity to really levy payments, which can improve the urban area. So I think that an enhanced land administration system combined with land use planning, climate change mitigation, and urban regularization are the four themes that come to mind as some of the most critical.
Okay, thank you so much, Maureen. Another question. You had mentioned earlier in your discussion the issue of refugees in Tanzania. Can you explain a little bit more about the tenure issues related to refugees in the country?
Sure. So Tanzania, and this is based on some experience I've had with Burundian refugees in areas like Tabora. There's, I think, 4 cluster areas where Burundi, and I'm going to just speak to my experience with Burundian refugees, is that Tanzania has one of the most progressive attitudes towards refugee influxes in the world. And to that, not only do they house refugees, but they also have worked very, very hard to ensure that enough land is available for them, for refugees to have livelihoods, to have a home, and to make significant strides to integrating, even giving citizenship to, for example, the new Tanzanians, which are the Burundian refugees who've been in the country for 30 years. Some of the tenure issues, the country, while the country has been so progressive and welcoming, they've also had a lot of stresses with new waves of refugees coming into the country, and living in some of the urban and rural areas. Let me just focus on urban areas specifically, is that these are refugees that are essentially, they may not be there with any particular protections by UNHCR, and so they're really trying to live under the radar, as it were. As a result, they're very vulnerable to eviction in urban areas, to poor treatment. That's the urban dimension. The rural dimension is simply the issues of allocation of land for refugee populations. And in the areas that I worked in, while there was sufficient land and fairly good relationships in terms of trade and partnering, they can be vulnerable to expropriation by the government if the stresses on the countryside become too much. I would say on the whole, the rural refugees are in better shape because they're generally under UNHCR protections and enjoy, many of the things that they need to live. Integration ultimately remains the issue because the conditions in neighboring countries are simply unsafe to go home. So you're looking at a protracted situation for refugees to stay. And so the problem is how to integrate them. What is their status as citizens or non-citizens?
Thanks again, Maureen. So we're going to take one last question, and then we're going to turn to our discussion of the voluntary guidelines. So Maureen, final question for you. What do you see as opportunities around securing women's land rights in Tanzania, and particularly around efforts to certify women's rights to land?
That's a great question, and some really, really good work has been done around women in especially in the village areas, securing their land rights. There was an effort underway for Maasai women to, I think something like 800 titles were received when Maasai women were really educated about their land rights. They were provided with opportunities to engage with the local village leadership. And I believe that project was under the Global Land Tool Network. Carol, you can speak to the MAST program under USAID if there's anything relevant there. The village councils, which is the leadership within the village, village land area, I believe that 3 out of 7 of the members of the council have to be women. So there is a quota for that. And I think that in terms of education, there have been many educational efforts to inform women of their land rights. I think the area of intervention needs to be on the kind of de facto situation on the ground, which are continuing attitudes of how land is either inherited or the succession practices as opposed to law. But there has been a lot of good work. And again, I think Carol might be able to say something about the MAST program if that is relevant toward women's land rights.
Okay, thank you, Maureen. I'm going to direct people, if you're interested in learning more about USAID's mobile application to secure tenure project, to www.land-links.org, where you can find the full text of the country profile as well as information about the MAST project. I know we did receive another question around the degree to which district land offices in Tanzania have adequate resources to do the important work that they're supposed to do under the Village Land Act of '99. So rather than rushing through an answer to that question, which is an excellent question, in our follow-up to this webinar, we will send out an answer to that question to this video that you can feel free to share with others. So for those of you who are here for the voluntary guidelines discussion, we're going to get started with that. But once again, Maureen, thank you so much for that overview of the Tanzania country land profile. All right, so what we're going to be doing now for the next few moments is providing a brief overview of the voluntary guidelines on the responsible governance of tenure, of land, fisheries, and forests, again, in the context of national food security. I want to say, to start with, you can find the text of what I will call either the VGGT or the guidelines at www.fao.org/tenure, and the FAO has translated the voluntary guidelines into 10 different languages. So hopefully you can find a language that works well for you. Okay, so let's get started. What are the VGGT? Well, to begin, they are an international document that can be used by a whole variety of people for a variety of different reasons. So states can use the voluntary guidelines, citizens and communities can use them, as well as private firms, civil society, academia, and land or tenure professionals. So this document was created to be useful to many different stakeholder groups in societies. I should say, for those of you who are taking our MOOC, you've seen us discuss the term land governance before, but for others who are joining us, I'm going to use the GLTN definition of land governance, which is that land governance is the process by which, regarding the access to and use of land, the manner in which those decisions are implemented, and the way that conflicting interests in land are reconciled. So that's a broad set of activities and ideas associated with land governance. Well, so why is it important to improve land governance? Why do we have an international document that's focused on this? This is important because when we have good land governance, we're better able to protect communities and vulnerable peoples on the ground. We're better able to promote economic growth in a sustainable way. We're better able to reduce conflicts, both conflicts within communities and conflicts between communities and others, whether those are investors or the government itself. And very importantly for this document, we're better able to enhance food security. So improving land governance isn't just a matter for or a concern of states. Instead, it's a matter for many people, and I think it's important to say that it's not just a matter of providing or titles to people. It's about increasing their perception that they are secure in their holding of land and resources. So citizens and communities have an important role to play here. They can improve governance by educating themselves so that they're better able to advocate for their legitimate tenure rights, and this can help drive positive change from the bottom up. The VGGT, for example, provides guidance to land professionals about what good practices should look like, the importance of participatory processes, and the critical importance of reducing corruption and improving transparency in our sector. This can also help improve land governance in important ways. I think an important point to note about the VGGT is that they do also address the private sector as part of the non-state group who are addressed in the document. And so private sector firms as well can help to improve land governance. They can do this by adapting the way that they do business. And so this can and should mean by recognizing and respecting legitimate tenure rights in areas where firms are operating, and especially that are acquiring rights to land, whether that's through greenfield investments or through brownfield investments where it's quite common to find, say, legacy land issues. Businesses are, according to the voluntary guidelines, supposed to take steps to safeguard against dispossessions of people, to share information about their projects and their activities with affected communities, to support informed decision-making through meaningful consultations and negotiations with local peoples. And this is important to create maybe a more level playing field between private sector firms, governments, and communities. Communities, of course, typically having less power, there being some power asymmetries in those relationships. Academics can also make use of the voluntary guidelines and support the role of improving good governance. The Academy has an important role to play in training up professionals, but also in doing research and providing monitoring services around the effectiveness of implementation of the voluntary guidelines. And finally, of course, the civil society has a critically important role to play in terms of promoting good land governance by advocating for improvements on this issue and by supporting a variety of different communities and vulnerable peoples whose rights may be impacted by states and by private sector actors who do not follow the guidance of the voluntary guidelines. Okay, so with that, what can you do sort of discussion, let's talk about a few basic backgrounds on the voluntary guidelines. So important to say the voluntary guidelines are voluntary. They are not a mandatory set of rules and principles. Instead, they are voluntary. They were adopted unanimously in 2012. So we've literally, we've just passed the 5-year anniversary of the adoption of the voluntary guidelines. They were adopted by member states of the Committee on World Food Security, and they were drafted in a very consultative process with meetings around the world and rounds of drafting that included active participation of communities, civil society, and the private sector. So because they were adopted unanimously in this highly consultative manner, the voluntary guidelines do represent an international consensus on good practices related to the recognition, protection, and documentation of rights, not just to land, but also to fisheries and to forests. I think it's also important to say that the voluntary guidelines place a special emphasis on gender equality, as well as on the rights of vulnerable and marginalized peoples. And importantly, they apply to all forms of property ownership, whether that's state ownership, private ownership, or customary ownership. And so an important component of the voluntary guidelines is that they encourage states to find appropriate ways to recognize customary tenure rights. And finally, they do also apply to other resources such as water, an issue that Maureen raised with regard to Tanzania. So what's in the voluntary guidelines? And we don't have time to go through this in depth, but I'll give you sort of high-level points and discussion points about what's included in the guidelines. Among other things, they contain guiding principles for states and non-state actors. And so these principles include ideas like ensuring gender equality in terms of tenure rights and access, consulting with and engaging in a participatory manner with people whose tenure rights might be impacted by either public or private actions, supporting transparent practices and processes in the land sector. I think importantly, advocating for accountability of state and non-state actors who transgress on rights or fail to recognize legitimate tenure rights. And then there's an emphasis on continuous improvement. So always trying to work to make sure that the land governance system is improving for the many stakeholders who are affected and impacted by this system. So digging just a little bit deeper, the voluntary guidelines tell us that states should recognize and respect all legitimate tenure rights holders and safeguard their rights against infringements, and that includes taking steps, responsible steps to identify and record rights. States are supposed to promote the enjoyment of legitimate tenure rights, provide access to justice for people whose rights have been violated, and work to prevent tenure disputes, violent actions, and corruption. And of course, corruption is an important issue in this sector. Businesses, on the other hand, one of the non-state actor groups, should respect human rights, the legitimate tenure rights of people with whom they're engaged. The voluntary guidelines do build on the UN guiding principles, and so do have a basis in and strong foundation in human rights issues, especially human rights issues related to business. Businesses should act with due diligence to avoid infringing on human rights, and so we've seen a lot of activity over the last several years since the publication of the voluntary guidelines or the issuance of the voluntary guidelines to work on support for the private sector around enhancing due diligence. And then businesses are also supposed to develop risk management and grievance mechanisms to avoid and address any concerns related to violations or impacts, negative impacts on tenure rights. So the voluntary guidelines also provide guidance on efforts to, I'm going to now move away from stakeholders to some substantive issues, efforts to identify, allocate, and recognize the rights of women, peoples, and peoples living under customary tenure systems. They do talk about the importance of transferring tenure rights and duties in an equitable, transparent, and cost-effective way through markets, restitution, or expropriation, and providing some guidance around those issues. And then there's a section on land administration, including issues such as keeping and maintaining land records, an important public sector function, land valuation, taxation, and spatial and land use planning. Towards the end of the document, there's some materials on emergencies, such as how might the sector adapt land governance to better address issues such as natural disasters and conflict. And then finally, at the end of the document, there's a recognition that it's important to monitor and evaluate how the VGGT are being implemented. So the guidelines cover a lot of topics. You can see it's a very rich resource, and it can be, this rich resource can be used in many ways. And I'm going to very quickly talk about how the document can be used, and then we will open up for some questions and answers on the voluntary guidelines. So how might you use this document? And again, let me just remind you that the full text of the document is available at the FAO's website. Could use it as a model to assess gaps in the current legal and administrative framework of a country. So if you had the VGGT in your hand and you were looking at the legal and regulatory framework of a country, you could use it as a kind of gap analysis to figure out where could improvements be made. Donors and investors might wish to use the VGGT as a kind of a checklist when they're working in a country to identify sort of similar issues. Where are their gaps? Where are their strengths? Where are their weaknesses in this country's legal and regulatory framework, or in the de facto environment that people are facing on the ground with regard to their tenure security and recognition of legitimate tenure rights. So once these gaps are identified, what can you do? Well, the VGGT can also help to provide guidance on the kinds of reforms that are needed, or a direction that's needed in order to create new laws or policies or improve existing laws and policies. So it's a very useful tool. Citizens and for civil society, the VGGT can be used as a kind of standard against which they can analyze the legal and regulatory environment in which they're living. So if the VGGT represent international consensus, they can look at the way the land sector is in their country and compare it to this international consensus view. And finally, they can also be used to identify the kinds of processes to help improve land governance. And these kinds of processes would include specific processes such as how do you create a participatory engagement activity, how do you create more transparency or promote greater transparency in the land sector, and how can you make the land sector and land administration a more gender equitable environment, or more equitable to vulnerable and marginalized populations. So the VGGT, the guidelines, are really a high-level document, but importantly, the FAO has been working for the past several years to develop some detailed technical guides on a number of different issues, and I really strongly encourage you, if you have a specific interest, to dive into these really rich resources that the FAO has produced related to the voluntary guidelines. And technical guides exist on issues of gender, forestry, indigenous peoples, agricultural investments, legal issues, pastoralist issues, the private sector, the commons, and most recently on fisheries. Okay, so with that then, while I have not provided you with a full list of what the voluntary guidelines is about, I think you can see, and I'm going to do this very quickly because we're running up against our time limit. I think you can see from what Maureen presented that there are lots of ways in which the voluntary guidelines could be used to address issues related to land and resource governance in Tanzania. And so, for example, you could use the voluntary guidelines to identify areas where Tanzania's legal and regulatory framework could potentially be improved or strengthened. This might be especially helpful or useful in relation to, say, women's land and resource rights, with regard to pastoralist issues, or maybe with regard to forests and forest products. Noting, however, Maureen pointed to the strengths, actually, of community forestry management. The voluntary guidelines also call on states to provide, and this is a quote, prompt, accessible, and non-discriminatory access, end of quote, to land governance services. This is an issue that the government of Tanzania is currently working on in several donor-funded projects, making access to these services easier for people in both urban and rural areas. And so very encouraging to see the government addressing that issue. Concerns that Maureen mentioned in Tanzania with regard to problems such as flooding, the voluntary guidelines could provide some guidance on the importance of planning to address natural disasters that impact tenure rights. For investors, and we know that there are a number of investors seeking rights to land in Tanzania, the voluntary guidelines do set out principles that they should follow to avoid or mitigate risks in their interactions with communities. And especially around the importance of developing careful due diligence processes, engaging with communities and consulting them in a meaningful way, and generally being operating in a more participatory, open, and transparent manner. Costs and simplified procedures associated with the issuance of land certificates. This is, for many rural citizens, a bit of a cumbersome process and a bit costly. The voluntary guidelines call on states to reduce those costs and make this process as accessible to citizens as is feasible for them. Okay, so with that then, again, that was a super quick look at the voluntary guidelines and just a little bit about how the guidelines could be used to maybe address some of the gaps or help strengthen some of the good elements of the legal and regulatory framework in Tanzania. We wanted to share with you this sense of how the VGGT could be used in a particular country following on the country profile. We have time for just a few, one or two questions, and let me take a question. I have to, bear with me a second, I have to look at the side of the screen. So we have a question from Daisy, who has a friend who works in Tanzania. His land, and she says his land was taken because the owner claimed it was not for sale, yet someone else had sold him the land and given him a title. What has the government or rural leaders done about such issues? Well, the government does have a land conflict system in place, and usually what happens is that conflicts at the local level in rural areas are handled by the village council. The village council is composed of local citizens. As Maureen mentioned earlier, a mix of both men and women. Would normally hear claims like this if you're in a rural area. If the dispute can't be resolved by the village council, it gets sent up to the ward level for resolution by ward tribunals. And if a claim can't be handled by a ward tribunal, it can be taken out of that system and into the court system in Tanzania. So Tanzania does actually have a pretty clearly defined process for addressing legal disputes like this, and that's in distinction maybe to some countries that wouldn't have such a clearly defined legal track for handling land disputes. Some countries, of course, have specialized land courts or adjudicative institutions. In Tanzania, at least in rural areas, again, these kinds of problems start at the village council level. So we have another question coming in from Burundi. Tanzania is a relatively stable country despite its heterogeneity. Tanzania's property rights and resource governance systems are evolving. Yeah, Maureen talked about that, I thought, in a really nice way. What are the major challenges currently faced that do not define the national interests in the system of governance of resources in Tanzania? What are the major challenges currently faced that do not define the national interests? I'm going to actually turn the microphone back over to Maureen to see, Maureen, if you have around what are the major challenges currently faced that do not define the system of. I'm trying to actually chat the question to Maureen. What are the major challenges currently faced that do not define or do not maybe align with national interests in Tanzania? So let me turn the floor back over, the mic back over to Maureen.
I'm thinking, as you were reading that to me, Carol, I had to think about it. I think for a moment, I was thinking about the classifications of land of general, reserved, and village lands, and the conversion of lands. And I would have to think about that a bit more. But one of the key issues in Tanzania is this issue of how land is converted, and so once, and I hope that I'm getting to the questioner's the essence of what he's trying to ask is, so we have these broad topics of climate change, trees, land tenure, and property rights, but a sub issue, one of the things that comes to mind is that for example, for investment or for development purposes, land at the village level can be converted from village land to general land. And what that classification means is that that once land is converted into general land, it falls under the ambit now of this central government. But interestingly, if a project does not succeed, so this is mostly in the case of foreign investment, it does not return to village land. So this is something that there's been a lot of commentary on this issue, is that once village land is converted to that general category of land, it cannot be reconverted back into village land, and that has a lot of implications. And you may not see this so much on the top level headlines about things that are happening in Tanzania, but there has been a really robust discussion about this issue, because it's sort of like once gone, gone forever, and I think that is an issue that is of concern to both to local communities, especially is the loss of land. I hope that is something that maybe the questioner wanted to hear a bit about. So thanks.
Thanks, Maureen. Yeah, that's a really important issue, how the government handles the reversionary rights to land, and to whom those rights revert at the end of either a leasehold period or when an investment doesn't quite work out. I guess I might just also add a bit more. It would be useful to have more clarity on resettlement issues and the process around resettlement. It's really important that the government does develop some needed infrastructure, but the process that's associated with developing that infrastructure in a participatory and equitable way is also important. The voluntary guidelines can maybe provide some useful guidance on thinking about that, but in general, resettlement issues, resettlement policies, compensation related to resettlement, issues around how public purpose is defined, could all be other important issues to address. So with that, am I looking for one more question? Looking for the team. Okay, good. All right, so we're done with questions then. With that then, on behalf of USAID's Office of Land and Urban, the FAO, and the Global Donor Working Group on Land, we'd like to thank you so much for joining us today. On behalf of Dr. Moriarty-Lempke and myself, we appreciate your time, and we look forward very much to seeing you again in the future. Thank you so much.